I love survivalist movies, and that's because if a survival film is done well, then you get to see drama at the highest stakes possible, presented in the most realistic way possible. What more could you desire from a film? Now, there are loads of movies that incorporate survivalist ideas. Jurassic Park, 28 Days Later, Jaws, Project Hail Mary, Mad Max, etc, etc. But that doesn't make them into actual survivalist films, which is why I've come up with 7 rules that tell us what a real survivalist film is actually made from, along with the 7 greatest survivalist movies ever made, which means this video is going to answer 2 questions at the same time. What makes a survivalist film, and what are the greatest survivalist films? I've tried to avoid spoilers, and incidentally, there's 2 films on this list about the same incident and 2 other films on the list by the same director. Can any clever clogs out there guess what they might be? Right, first rule. In survivalist films, nature is always the ultimate nemesis. In other words, the environment is not just there as a background or scenery, it's the actual enemy. Survivalist films always involve isolation from our own civilization in a place with scarce resources and a hostile environment. Take one of my absolute favourite survivalist films, Cast Away. Tom Hanks' enemies in this film are waves, sharp bits of rock, the weather, thirst, hunger, and even tooth decay. Which means survivalist films do something I always value hugely. They make us appreciate our own world, even, as Tom Hanks' tooth problems demonstrate, even dentists. Now, nature being the true nemesis takes films like Deliverance or the more recent Eden out of the survivalist camp. They have survivalist tones to them, no doubt, but they're not the true thing. Environment is the enemy, not evil people. No preaching needed in survival films, no morality lessons please, nature is the enemy and she's a bugger. Cast Away reminds us that survivalist culture goes back at least as far as Daniel Defoe's 1719 novel, Robinson Crusoe, based, as so much survivalist work seems to be, on a true story, the sea wrecking and survival of the sailor Alexander Selkirk. But we can discover elements of the genre much further back, past one of my favourite survivalist accounts in ancient literature, Xenophon's Anabasis, the, you guessed it, real-life account of thousands of Greek mercenaries forced to walk home from Persia through 1,500 miles of the most hostile lands and peoples. It's an incredible account. Walter Hill kind of made it into the movie The Warriors, but can we please have a modern film version? In any case, we can track elements of survivalism even further back to the pre-classical age with the Odyssey, where Odysseus and his crew have to survive an equally arduous journey home. But back to Cast Away, which brings all those Robinson Crusoe themes to the big screen. Man, bereft of modernity, using his own resourcefulness to survive against nature. And that survival is never easy. Just look at the struggle Hank suffers to create fire.
Have made fire!
Cast Away goes right back to simple basics, and in doing so creates something profound. We actually see the evolutionary story of our species during the film, learning how to make shelter, how to find food, to make fire, learning to tame nature in order to survive. Okay, new rule please. In survivalist films, our heroes have to be isolated. They have to be cut off from their and our usual civilization. This feeling of loneliness and separation is crucial to all survival tales. And that's because most survival films tell us, often by inference or by its lacking and contrast, they tell us about our own modern civilization. Which makes a film like Apollo 13, a great story turned into a great film with plenty of survivalist elements. It's a little watered down on the survival front by the constant contact we have with mission control. That prevents our astronauts from being truly alone. And that brings me to my second great survivalist movie, Nick Roeg's Walkabout, a film about 2 school kids stuck in the Australian outback who are essentially saved by encountering an Aborigine on Walkabout. It's a great movie where our characters are isolated or at least only adjacent to civilization, and it's a great movie because it constantly talks to us about our own civilization through this sense of isolation and contrast. Much of the material was shot by a tiny crew struggling to film, often struggling to cope in harsh conditions. That sunburn there was real, and the improvised cure was made into a scene in the film. Improvisation provided much of the material. Apparently, the actual script itself was only 17 pages long. And improvisation means the performances are superb, particularly from Rogue's own son, Luke, who twitters away brilliantly throughout, just like young kids do.
And her mouth was opening and shutting. But he couldn't hear because she was speaking silently to herself.
So, despite the extremity of the situation, and perhaps the artsy filmmaking style, it all feels real and authentic, which is absolutely crucial. Indeed, that brings me on to point 3. Survival films have to feel absolutely real, absolutely authentic, and I really mean that. You have to believe everything that takes place is actually happening. We're not in a Hollywood dream world, which is why so many of the best survivalist films are in fact based on true stories, because when we see based on true story, or on the true story of, or likewise appearing in the title of our films or in the text afterwards or wherever, as soon as we see that kind of text, we automatically accept most of what we're watching actually happened in some form or another. Events may feel incredible or even impossible, but we must always believe those events are true. Which is why films like The Martian or Project Hail Mary don't make my list. Oh, and while we're in space, let's add Gravity too. Although these films pay lip service to trying to survive, they rely on long shots and, excuse the obvious phrasing, Hail Marys. Hollywood may love such miraculous moments, but they aren't actually believable in our everyday real world, and so don't work well as pure survivalist movies. Equally, The Edge and The Grey, both of which turn their natural dangers into actual animals, a bear in the case of The Edge and wolves with The Grey, well, they both go to Jaws in personifying the threat into an actual living creature. In doing so, both films lose out in believability terms. The bear, the shark, and the wolves, none of those creatures act in believable ways. And that goes for humans too. We need believable humans, so in survival films, we don't want characters telling other characters, I promise you, we'll be okay.
You're gonna get out of here. You're gonna die an old lady, warm in her bed.
You don't know that, Leo. We have to believe everything. We want truth, authenticity, and realism. Which brings me to one of my favourite survival films, The Impossible. This movie succeeds because at its heart it involves what could be the most basic survival instinct of all, keeping your children safe. The film is based on, of course, a true incident, the 2004 tsunami, which killed 5,500 people in Thailand alone, including over 2,000 foreign tourists. So this is a real event and a film itself based on a true family with a real story. But more than just its basing, The Impossible always feels authentic. So much of the pre-accident happenings in the film just feels everyday and normal and mundane before the larger events intrude. And when those larger events do intrude, well, we just believe everything. It all feels so real, and that's because it's a really well-made film. And that's in no small part to some absolutely fantastic acting, especially from the children, and especially from a very young Tom Holland, who is really terrific in this film.
Mom, stop it!
The Impossible works so well because it feels proper and real and authentic. You cannot but help feel like you're watching real events unfolding. You're watching a small, potentially tragic story set within a far greater tragedy. So, authenticity, hugely important rule. Let's have another. Stakes are always at their very highest in survivalist films. Death is what all survival movies are fighting to avoid. And that survival, if you are to survive, has to come against all the odds. This is always about surviving at the extremes. But against the odds does not mean miracles or long shots. Remember rule number 3, no Hail Marys or silly Deus Ex Machinas or long shot miracle cures. So, life and death struggle please, with survival always stacked against you. Which brings me to Society of the Snow, a film made about the true story of a team of Uruguayan rugby players stuck in the freezing Andes for 79 days after a plane crash and being presumed dead. The band of rugby players are forced to eat the dead bodies of their comrades in order to survive. Society of the Snow is brilliantly made. Torment after torment seems to come to these poor souls. The crash itself is already horrific, but trying to survive the immediate aftermath of the crash, that's already a whole new struggle. And then we get to the whole avalanche section, which on its own is a brilliant life or death story. Society of the Snow is expertly made, and in fact this is the second film in this list directed by the Spaniard J.A. Bayona, who also directed the brilliant The Impossible. Clearly an accomplished survivalist director who was also responsible for Jurassic Park Fallen Kingdom, which goes to show you can bring a great survivalist director to a great survivalist franchise and still end up with something very mediocre. So yes, the odds are always stacked against you in great survivalist films. Remember, death awaits failure, and not just death, even in the case of Society of the Snow, becoming dinner for your mates. How charming, which brings me on to rule number 5. Survivalist films require the breaking of taboos, those rules of normal, polite society. We've left our normal world to survive our new environment. Our heroes usually have to cross taboos that exist in our old normal world. Now, those taboos can be small things like little Tom Holland seeing his injured mother naked, or indeed actually seeing her injuries as well. Or it can be really big things like the act of cannibalism. Which brings me to the second film in my list based on that Uruguayan rugby team crashed in the Andes, Alive, where, true to life, our heroes have to resort to cannibalism to survive. Now, both Society of the Snow and Alive are brilliant films. Different, but both brilliant. Alive is sometimes accused of turning a survival issue into a Hollywood film, of Hollywoodizing it, but sorry, I couldn't disagree more. I'm really much more impressed they managed to make a Hollywood film about such a harrowing subject and do it so realistically. On which subject can I say the plane crash in the film is one of the best plane crashes I've seen in any Hollywood film, and no joke, I once watched this scene on a real plane flight. Alive does more than justifying cannibalism. It's a fascinating portrait of leadership. A rugby team is involved, so concepts of teamwork and leadership come under particular scrutiny. In order to survive, the group have to coalesce around a leader, but that leader, and indeed the needs of the group, changes as the film progresses, showing that what you need to survive can change along with your environment. Which brings me to my next rule. It's usually bravery, intelligence, fortitude, and sheer resilience that can save our heroes' lives, which allows me here to bring in one of my absolute favourite survival films, Touching the Void. This isn't just based on a true story, and by the way, the book is excellent and I highly recommend it. The film itself is done as a documentary style reenactment of the original story.
I was just convinced he was dead.
And it's told and reenacted by the actual real pair that these amazing events happen to. Touching the Void is truly an incredible story of resilience in the face of almost certain death, and it's told and done brilliantly. If you haven't seen it, find it and watch it at once. This is the only film, and I can guarantee this, where Brown Girl in the Ring by Boney M becomes a crucial means of survival.
Bloody hell, I'm going to die to Boney M.
Honestly, Touching the Void is a quite unbelievable story, handled brilliantly, and I thoroughly recommend it. Which leaves my final film and rule. To be a true survivalist film, surviving itself must take up the majority of the film. By all means, use flashbacks or dreams or cut back to what's happening back home. We don't need to spend every minute of our film surviving, but the main bulk of our film must concern the actual act of surviving. which is why there's no films like The Revenant on this list. Sure, the film contains survivalist elements, once again, but there's too much drama and other plot going on in the film. The revenge story, characters that are baddies, it lacks a pure survivalist experience beginning to end. On the other hand, a film like 127 Hours uses flashbacks and impressionistic dream sequences, but it always stays true to the, again, true story of Aaron Ralston, a hiker and climber who has to cut off his own arm in order to survive when he becomes stuck behind a rock. Danny Boyle, the director, takes an impressionistic style to the film. Remember, all survival films have to feel real, but they don't need to be realistic, as 127 Hours proves. Even so, the subjective, impressionistic style works for what our hero is having to go through. We are all experiencing his dreams, his dilemma, but survival and surviving is always the main thrust of the film, and it makes that list not just because it's a great survival movie, it's also a great movie. In my opinion, director Danny Boyle's best. Okay, that's my list. I've a few honourable mentions that are also definitely worth a watch, even if they aren't quite classics enough to make this list. Open Water, for example, is a really horrific film, totally terrifies me, that one. The Survivalist, a recent film, done brilliantly, so it also feels very authentic. That film almost made this list. There's The Jungle with Daniel Radcliffe, also surprisingly hardcore. The Road, also pretty good. All Is Lost, again a recent film and surprisingly good. It's always tough when your characters are alone. 127 Hours uses flashbacks and fantasy. Castaway uses a football as a conversation partner, but All Is Lost stays mostly dialogue free, which is quite an achievement on its own. The Edge has its moments, although Art Linson's book about the filming, What Happened, is absolutely priceless. You will think differently about Alex Baldwin and beards if you read it, I guarantee. And finally, Everest deserves a mention. Great script, well executed film. So all those films, not absolute classics, but highly recommended. Okay, that's my list. Have I missed any other films? Any rules to making a great survivalist movie? Do let me know in the comment section. Oh, and do like and subscribe. And good luck surviving out there.